My boss mocked me for working weekends, so I made sure his vacation got cancelled. I never thought I would be betrayed by someone I trusted, especially not in front of the entire office. But there I was, standing in the conference room on a Monday morning, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on me as my boss, Derek, held up my weekend report like it was a joke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with that smirk I'd grown to despise, "I present to you our weekend warrior, Olivia Chen." While the rest of us were enjoying our lives, she was here, grinding away like some sort of corporate robot. The laughter that followed felt like needles under my skin. Not the kind of gentle teasing between colleagues, but something sharper, more cruel. Sarah from accounting actually snorted. Mike from sales shook his head like I was some pathetic creature who'd lost her way. I'd worked that entire weekend because Derek had dumped the Morrison account analysis on my desk Friday at 5 p.m., claiming it was urgent and needed to be ready for this very meeting. I'd sacrificed dinner with my sister, cancelled my Saturday morning yoga class, and spent Sunday hunched over spreadsheets instead of reading in the park like I'd planned. All because I believed him when he said it mattered. "You know, Olivia," Derek continued, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd heard too many times before, "there's something called work-life balance. Maybe you should look into it. The company won't fall apart if you take a break." The irony burned. This was the same man who'd been breathing down my neck for months, questioning my dedication during my performance reviews, suggesting I wasn't committed enough to advance in the company. The same man who'd hinted that my colleagues were outpacing me because they went above and beyond. I felt my cheeks flush, that familiar heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to point out the hypocrisy of his words. But instead, I stood there, frozen, watching my hard work become the punchline of his joke. It wasn't just the humiliation, though that stung enough. It was the realization that this wasn't the first time. There had been other moments, smaller ones that I'd brushed off or rationalized away. The times he'd interrupted me in meetings. The way he'd claimed credit for my ideas. The subtle ways he'd made me question my own worth. As I finally took my seat, hands trembling slightly as I opened my laptop, I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue to let these moments define me, continue to swallow my pride and accept this treatment as some inevitable part of climbing the corporate ladder. Or I could choose to change everything. The meeting continued around me, but my mind was elsewhere, processing what had just happened and what it meant. I thought about all the weekends I'd given up, all the times I'd stayed late while others left promptly at 5. I thought about the promotion I'd been passed over for last month, and the explanation Derek had given me about cultural fit. But mostly, I thought about the person I used to be before I started working here. Confident. Decisive. Someone who didn't accept disrespect disguised as humor. That person felt like a stranger now, buried under months of self-doubt and calculated submission. But maybe, just maybe, she was still there, waiting for the right moment to resurface. As Derek droned on about quarterly projections, one question echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing minute: will I choose to stay silent? Or will I take control of my own story? The weekend humiliation was just the tip of the iceberg. As I sat there, listening to Derek's voice fade into background noise, my mind began excavating memories I'd carefully buried, small betrayals that had accumulated like sediment, layer by layer, until they'd formed this heavy weight in my chest. There was the time 3 months ago when I'd presented my idea for streamlining our client onboarding process. I'd spent weeks researching, creating flowcharts, gathering data. Derek had nodded thoughtfully, asked a few probing questions, then dismissed me with a vague "I'll think about it." 2 weeks later, in the very same conference room, he presented my exact proposal as his own breakthrough solution. When I'd approached him privately afterward, he'd looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "I'm sure we both came to similar conclusions independently. Great minds think alike, right?" The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I'd actually started to doubt myself. Had I somehow unconsciously absorbed his idea? Was I being paranoid? Then there was Jennifer's promotion. Jennifer, who'd started 6 months after me but somehow leapfrogged into the senior analyst position I'd been working toward for 2 years. When I'd asked Derek about it during my review, he'd leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Olivia, you're technically competent, don't get me wrong. But Jennifer brings something extra to the table. She's got that natural leadership quality, you know? That executive presence." He paused, studying my face. "Maybe work on being more assertive? Speak up more in meetings." The irony was suffocating. Every time I did speak up in meetings, Derek would interrupt me or redirect the conversation. When I tried to assert myself, he'd labeled it as being difficult or not a team player. I was trapped in an impossible cycle, too quiet to be leadership material, too assertive to be likable. But perhaps the most painful betrayal was the one that happened just last month. I'd been working late, again, when I overheard Derek on a phone call in his office. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried down the hallway. "Yeah, she's reliable enough for the grunt work," he was saying, presumably about me. "But between you and me, she's just not C-suite material. Too, I don't know, soft? She takes things too personally. You need someone with thicker skin for the big leagues." I'd stood there in the hallway, paralyzed, listening to him reduce 2 years of my life to a handful of dismissive sentences. All those extra hours, all that dedication, all those sacrifices, he saw them as nothing more than the expected output of someone he'd already written off. The worst part wasn't even his words. It was how easily I'd internalized them. After that night, I'd found myself second-guessing every instinct, every contribution, every thought. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was too soft, too sensitive, too naive for this world. I'd started shrinking in meetings, offering fewer ideas, staying later to compensate for what I perceived as my inherent inadequacy. I'd become a ghost of my former self, moving through the office like I was constantly apologizing for taking up space, but sitting there now, with the taste of today's humiliation still bitter in my mouth. I wondered if I'd been looking at this all wrong. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was too soft. Maybe the problem was that I'd forgotten how to be strong. These weren't just isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They formed a pattern, a deliberate erosion of my confidence and self-worth. Each small betrayal had been carefully calculated to keep me in my place, grateful for scraps and too insecure to demand more. The question that haunted me now wasn't whether these wounds existed, they were real, and they ran deep. The question was whether I had the courage to examine them properly, to understand how they'd shaped me, and most importantly, whether I could heal them. Can I confront the hidden wounds, or will they remain buried forever? Something shifted in me that afternoon. Maybe it was the way Derek's laughter still echoed in my ears, or maybe it was the sudden clarity that came from finally seeing the pattern for what it was. But as I sat at my desk, staring at the Morrison report that had cost me my weekend and earned me nothing but ridicule, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anger, not the helpless, internalized anger that had been eating away at me for so long. This was different. Clean. Purposeful. It felt like waking up after a long, disorienting dream. I opened a new document on my computer and began typing. Not a work report or a project proposal, but something else entirely, a list. Every slight, every stolen idea, every moment of gaslighting and manipulation. Seeing it all laid out in black and white was both devastating and liberating. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. For the first time in months, I wasn't questioning my own memory or wondering if I was being too sensitive. I was simply documenting facts. And the facts told a story of systematic undermining that no reasonable person could dismiss. As I typed, I thought about the woman I'd been when I first started this job. Confident, ambitious, unafraid to speak my mind. She felt like someone from another lifetime, but I could still remember what it felt like to inhabit her skin. The way she'd walk into a room expecting to be heard, not hoping to be tolerated. That woman wouldn't have accepted Derek's treatment. She would have called him out the first time he interrupted her, the first time he took credit for her work. She certainly wouldn't have worked weekends for someone who saw her as nothing more than a convenient punching bag. But here's what that woman didn't know. What I was only now beginning to understand: sometimes you have to lose yourself completely before you can find who you're meant to become. Sometimes the breaking has to happen before the rebuilding can begin. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. Not the naive optimism I'd once carried, but something deeper and more sustainable. The knowledge that I had choices, even when the situation felt impossible. Derek thought he'd broken me today. He thought that public humiliation would remind me of my place, keep me small and grateful and compliant. What he didn't realize was that he'd actually done me a favor. He'd shown me exactly who he was and exactly what I was worth to him. And now I could act accordingly. The question wasn't whether I deserved better, I knew I did. The question wasn't whether Derek's behavior was acceptable, it clearly wasn't. The only question that mattered now was what I was going to do about it. I thought about Jennifer, sailing through her promotion while I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. I thought about my stolen ideas being presented as Derek's innovations. I thought about all the other women in this office who might be experiencing the same slow erosion of confidence, the same systematic diminishment. Maybe this wasn't just about me anymore. Maybe this was about creating change that would outlast my own time here. I opened my laptop again and began researching company policies, HR procedures, documentation requirements. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. Methodically. Strategically. For the first time in months, I had a plan. And for the first time in even longer, I felt like myself again. Can I find the courage to change my life, or will I hesitate when it matters most? That evening, I stayed late, not because Derek had demanded it, but because I had work to do. Real work. The kind that mattered. I pulled up the company directory and began mapping out the power structure, identifying the key players who could make or break Derek's carefully constructed image. There was Margaret Walsh, the VP of Operations, who'd built her reputation on promoting workplace equity. There was James Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who headed up HR and had recently implemented new anti-harassment policies. And there was Rebecca Martinez, the CFO, who'd been quietly cleaning house in other departments. These weren't people who would tolerate Derek's behavior if they knew about it. The problem was that Derek was skilled at managing upward, charming and competent with his superiors while being toxic to those beneath him. I needed to change that dynamic. I opened the document I'd started earlier and began expanding it, but this time with forensic precision. Every incident needed dates, witnesses, and supporting evidence. The Morrison report fiasco was just the beginning. I had emails where Derek had contradicted himself, meeting minutes where my contributions had been attributed to others, and performance reviews filled with subjective criticisms that didn't align with my actual output, but documentation alone wouldn't be enough. Derek was politically savvy, and he'd spin this as a disgruntled employee's vendetta if I wasn't careful. I needed something more immediate, more public, more undeniable. That's when I remembered the Hartley presentation. Next Friday, Derek was scheduled to present our Q3 strategy to the entire executive team. It was his biggest moment of the quarter, the presentation he'd been preparing for weeks. What the executives didn't know was that 60% of that strategy had come from my research and analysis. I had the original files, the revision history, the email trail showing how my ideas had been gradually absorbed into his vision. More importantly, I knew something Derek didn't. He'd made a critical error in his financial projections. A small mistake in his formula that would compound over the quarter, potentially costing the company significant revenue. I'd caught it during my weekend work but hadn't had the chance to mention it before Monday's humiliation. The beauty of it was its simplicity. I wouldn't need to sabotage anything or make false accusations. I would simply let Derek present his flawed strategy to the people who mattered most, then provide the corrected analysis with full documentation of its origins. The executive team would see not only that Derek had stolen my work, but that he'd done so carelessly, without understanding it well enough to catch his own mistakes. I spent the next 3 hours crafting my alternative presentation. Every slide was meticulously sourced, every claim backed by data. But more than that, it told a story, not just of Derek's incompetence, but of the culture that had allowed it to flourish. As I worked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement. Not the nervous energy of trying to please someone else, but the pure adrenaline of being genuinely good at what I did. This was who I was meant to be: strategic, thorough, uncompromising in my pursuit of excellence. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Derek would hang himself with his own rope, and I would simply provide the platform. By next Friday evening, everyone would know exactly what kind of leader he really was. But as I saved the final version of my presentation and gathered my things to leave, a whisper of doubt crept in. Revenge was intoxicating in the planning stages, but what about the aftermath? What about the person I would become once I'd executed this plan? Will I feel victorious when it's over, or will the consequences leave me feeling empty? Friday arrived with the weight of inevitability. I'd spent the week in a state of controlled calm, watching Derek prepare for his presentation with an almost meditative detachment. Every time he practiced his talking points in the conference room, every time he rehearsed slides that contained my analysis presented as his insights, I felt no anger, just a quiet certainty that justice was finally within reach. The executive team gathered at 2 p.m. sharp. Margaret Walsh, James Chen, Rebecca Martinez, and 3 other VPs filled the mahogany conference room while Derek set up his laptop with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. I sat in the back corner, invited as a supporting team member, my own laptop closed. My alternative presentation loaded and ready. Derek began with his usual charm offensive, complimenting the leadership team and setting up his comprehensive Q3 strategy. For 20 minutes, I watched him present my market analysis, my competitive research, my carefully calculated projections, all delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who believed his own mythology. Then came the financial projections. The section where his error lay buried in cell C47 of a spreadsheet he'd clearly never fully examined. As he clicked to the revenue forecast slide, explaining how his strategy would boost quarterly earnings by 18%, I felt my pulse steady rather than quicken. These numbers look aggressive. Derek, Rebecca Martinez interrupted, her CFO instincts already detecting something off. Can you walk us through your calculation methodology? I watched Derek's confident smile flicker for just a moment. Of course, Rebecca. The model accounts for market expansion, client retention improvements, and operational efficiency gains. His explanation was vague, dancing around the specifics because he didn't actually understand the formulas I'd built. Rebecca's frown deepened with each evasive answer. That's when I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "I think there might be some confusion about those projections." The room turned toward me. Derek's face went through a fascinating progression of expressions: surprise, annoyance, then barely concealed panic. "Olivia, we can discuss any questions after," he began. "Actually," Margaret Walsh interjected, "if there's an issue with the numbers, we should address it now." "Olivia, you worked on this analysis, didn't you?" "I did." I opened my laptop and pulled up my presentation. In fact, I developed the entire methodology Derek just presented. And I found a significant error in his projections. The silence that followed was electric. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I projected my screen onto the main display, showing side-by-side comparisons. My original analysis with timestamps and revision history. Derek's version with the critical miscalculation. The corrected projections showing a 4% revenue decline instead of an 18% increase. "The error compounds across 3 variables," I explained, my voice steady and professional. "If we'd implemented this strategy as presented, we'd be looking at significant losses by Q4. Rebecca leaned forward, studying the numbers. "Olivia, can you send me your original files? I want to verify this independently." "Of course. I have complete documentation going back 6 weeks. I could feel Derek's stare burning into me, but I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the executive team, watching their faces as the magnitude of what had just happened sank in. Margaret Walsh closed her notebook with a sharp snap. "Derek, I think we need to reschedule this presentation. Olivia, can you prepare a corrected strategy proposal for Monday?" "Already done," I replied, clicking to my final slide. "I can have the full analysis to everyone by end of day." As the executives filed out, their whispered conversations filling the hallway, Derek and I were left alone in the conference room. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had just shifted. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. I met his gaze steadily. "I know exactly what I've done." But as I packed up my laptop and walked toward the door, one question echoed in my mind louder than any sense of victory: will I feel relieved after this, or will it leave me questioning everything? The weekend that followed felt surreal, like existing in the aftermath of an earthquake where the ground beneath me had fundamentally shifted. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I found myself sitting on my apartment balcony Saturday morning, coffee growing cold in my hands, trying to understand the hollow feeling in my chest. Derek's career was effectively over, that much was clear. By Friday evening, Rebecca Martinez had confirmed my calculations, and by Monday morning, the entire incident would be common knowledge throughout the company. Margaret Walsh had already scheduled a meeting with me for Tuesday to discuss expanded responsibilities and leadership opportunities. Everything I'd worked toward was finally within reach. So why did I feel so empty? I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. The look on Derek's face when he realized what was happening. The way his confidence crumbled as I systematically dismantled his presentation. The silence in the room as the executives absorbed the magnitude of his deception. I'd expected to feel powerful in that moment. I'd expected the satisfaction of justice served, of wrongs finally righted. Instead, I'd felt something closer to pity, not for Derek, who deserved everything he got, but for the person I'd become in the process of bringing him down. The woman who'd stood up in that conference room wasn't the same person who'd been humiliated the previous Monday. She was harder, more calculating, more willing to destroy someone else to protect herself. She was everything Derek had taught me to be through months of systematic cruelty. Had I won, or had I simply become him? Sunday evening, my sister Emma called. We hadn't spoken much since I'd started canceling our regular dinners to work late. Another casualty of my toxic relationship with this job. "I heard through the grapevine that something big happened at your office," she said, her voice warm with concern. "Are you okay?" I found myself crying before I could answer. Not tears of victory or relief, but something deeper: grief for the person I used to be, confusion about who I was becoming. "I won," I told her through my tears. "I finally stood up to my boss, and I won. But Emma, I don't feel like myself anymore. I feel like I've lost something important. And I don't know if I can get it back." Emma listened as I poured out the whole story, not just Friday's confrontation, but months of accumulated pain and the gradual erosion of my sense of self. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Liv," she said finally, using the childhood nickname that made me feel like I was 12 again, "you've been surviving. But survival isn't the same as living. You did what you had to do to protect yourself, but now you get to choose who you want to be next." Her words stayed with me through the sleepless night that followed. I'd been so focused on the mechanics of revenge, the documentation, the strategy, the execution, that I hadn't considered what would come after. I'd assumed that destroying Derek would somehow restore everything he'd taken from me. But confidence isn't won through conquest. Self-worth isn't validated by someone else's downfall. Monday morning arrived with its familiar weight of anxiety, but this time it was different. Instead of dreading the day ahead, I found myself genuinely curious about who I would choose to be in this new landscape. Would I become the kind of leader who ruled through fear and manipulation, or could I find a different path? As I got dressed for work, I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me wasn't the broken victim Derek had tried to create, but she wasn't the confident professional I used to be either. She was someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal and reborn through the choice to fight back. The question now wasn't whether Derek had gotten what he deserved, he had. The question was whether I could forgive myself for what I'd become in the process of giving it to him. Has revenge really brought me peace, or is there more healing to be done? Tuesday's meeting with Margaret Walsh changed everything. But not in the way I'd expected. I'd prepared for a discussion about promotions and expanded responsibilities, armed with my corrected analysis and ready to claim the recognition I'd earned. Instead, Margaret surprised me by asking a different question entirely. "Olivia, what do you want?" I sat there, stunned by the simplicity of it. When was the last time anyone had asked me what I wanted, rather than what I could do for them? When was the last time I'd even asked myself? "I'm not sure I understand," I replied carefully. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of attention I'd forgotten was possible. "You've just demonstrated exceptional analytical skills, remarkable courage, and the kind of integrity this company needs. But I get the sense you're not sure what to do with that power now that you have it." She was right, of course. I'd spent so much energy focusing on what Derek had taken from me that I'd never stopped to consider what I actually wanted to build for myself. "Tell me about the person you were before all this," Margaret continued. "What brought you joy in your work? What made you feel alive?" The question unlocked something I'd kept buried for months. I found myself talking about the early days of my career, when solving complex problems felt like solving puzzles, when collaborating with colleagues felt like building something meaningful together. I talked about the satisfaction of mentoring junior analysts, the thrill of presenting ideas that could genuinely improve people's work lives. Somewhere in that conversation, I realized something profound. Derek hadn't taken these things from me. I'd given them up, piece by piece, in my attempts to survive his toxicity. But they were still there, waiting for me to reclaim them. "What if," Margaret said, "instead of focusing on what Derek did wrong, we focused on what you want to do right?" Over the following weeks, I discovered what empowerment actually felt like. It wasn't the cold satisfaction of watching Derek clean out his desk or the hollow victory of being proved right. It was the warm certainty that came from remembering who I was at my core and choosing to be that person regardless of who tried to diminish me. I started volunteering to mentor new hires, sharing not just technical skills but the kind of confidence-building support I wished I'd had. I began speaking up in meetings again, not to prove I was right, but to contribute ideas that could help the team succeed. I rekindled relationships with colleagues I'd withdrawn from during my darkest months. Most importantly, I stopped defining myself in relation to Derek's opinion of me. His judgment of my executive presence became irrelevant because I finally understood that true leadership wasn't about commanding through fear or manipulation. It was about creating environments where everyone could do their best work. The woman I was becoming felt both familiar and completely new. She had the confidence of my younger self but tempered with hard-won wisdom. She had learned to be strong without becoming cruel, assertive without being aggressive, powerful without being destructive. One evening, as I prepared to leave the office at a reasonable hour for the first time in months, I caught my reflection in the window. The person looking back at me wasn't the broken victim Derek had tried to create, nor was she the calculating avenger I'd briefly become. She was someone I could respect, someone I could live with, someone I was proud to be. But as I gathered my things and headed toward the elevator, one question lingered in my mind. Am I ready to move forward, or is there still something I need to let go of? 6 months later, I found myself in the same conference room where Derek had once humiliated me, but everything had changed. I was presenting my quarterly strategy to the executive team, not as someone desperately trying to prove her worth, but as the newly promoted director of strategic analysis, sharing insights I was genuinely excited about. The presentation went smoothly, filled with the kind of collaborative discussion I'd always imagined workplace interactions could be. When Rebecca Martinez complimented my forward-thinking approach, I felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with validation from others and everything to do with knowing I'd done meaningful work. After the meeting, I walked past Derek's former office, now occupied by Jennifer, who'd turned out to be a thoughtful and collaborative leader once freed from Derek's toxic influence. The space that had once felt charged with anxiety now held nothing more significant than memories of a difficult but ultimately transformative period of my life. That evening, I met Emma for dinner at our favorite restaurant, a weekly tradition we'd resumed months ago. As we sat across from each other, sharing stories about our weeks, I marveled at how normal this felt. How peaceful. You know what strikes me most about you lately? Emma said, pausing to sip her wine. You laugh differently now. It's not the careful, quiet laugh you developed during those awful months. It's your real laugh again, the one I remember from when we were kids. She was right. Somewhere in the process of rebuilding myself, I'd rediscovered joy. Not the desperate happiness that comes from external validation, but the steady contentment that flows from living in alignment with your values. I thought about Derek sometimes, though not with anger or satisfaction. I'd heard through the office grapevine that he'd landed a position at a smaller firm, hopefully having learned something from his experience. I genuinely hoped he had. His toxicity had been a poison that hurt him as much as anyone else, even if he couldn't see it at the time. But mostly, I thought about the young woman who'd started this job 2 years ago, full of ambition and hope. She'd thought success meant earning the approval of people like Derek, climbing ladders that led to empty achievements. She'd measured her worth by external metrics and tied her identity to other people's opinions. The woman I was now understood something she didn't. True empowerment isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about knowing yourself so deeply that no one else's opinion can shake your foundation. It's about choosing to be kind without being weak, strong without being cruel, successful without sacrificing your humanity. My phone buzzed with a text from one of the junior analysts I'd been mentoring. Thank you for the feedback on my presentation. Your belief in me means everything. I smiled, remembering how desperately I'd once craved those words from Derek. Now I understood that the real gift wasn't in receiving such messages, it was in being the kind of person who could genuinely offer them to others. As Emma and I walked home under the city lights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with who I was and where I was going. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibilities I would choose for myself, rooted in values I would never again compromise. I was finally, fully, free.